Okay, welcome to part 4 of Floodplain 101 for Realtors. My name is John Hayes. I'm the Floodplain Coordinator for Santa Cruz County, and I will be your presenter again today. The objective of this presentation is to strengthen your ability to provide the best customer service to your clients and to assist local communities and residents with identifying and reducing flood risks. Today's agenda, we're going to look at some things that can help you educate not only your clients, but also protect yourself and be able to answer some questions that may come up. So if we look at some client questions that come up, could we build an addition to this home in the future? If the property is in a regulated floodplain, the answer, generally speaking, is yes, but a floodplain use permit will be required. That is a requirement of federal law. The county is required to obtain a floodplain use permit for any construction activity, building, grading, filling within a floodplain per federal statutes. A substantial improvement determination will need to be made also. Is the improvement being made considered substantial? i.e., is the value of the work and labor equal to or exceeding 50% of the value of the structure? Or if the structure was damaged, does the damage equal or exceed 50% of the value of the structure? For more information, people should contact the flood control district and talk to the floodplain administrator before they even start their plans. That way they can learn the details of what would be required. We like to say that the sooner people talk with us, the sooner we get out of their project. Another client question may be, how can I be relieved of floodplain regulations? Generally speaking, if we're talking about a federally mapped floodplain, the only way to be relieved of the regulations is to have the property removed from the floodplain. Generally speaking, that's either going to be done through a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision that shows that the structure is not in the regulated floodplain. In the local regulated floodplains, we need to have a determination that the building and potentially even the ground around the building is outside. This is going to be done through an elevation certificate. If the elevation certificate shows that the building is high enough but the ground isn't, the building does not get out of the permitting requirements, but it is considered conforming, therefore is subject to lesser regulatory requirements. So what's the realtor's role in all this? Generally speaking, the main role for the realtor is just to be informed and to do the research. Communicate early. Arizona state law requires the floodplain status of the property be given to the buyer within 10 days of closing. Ideally, we would like to see that happen right up front so that a person knows before they even decide anything else about the home if they're going to have flood insurance or not. The more information is better, generally speaking. You can also help by dispelling misconceptions when you hear them. Now, obviously, we're not going to expect you to remember all of this, but maybe some of this might stick. Hurricanes are the #1 disaster in the country. We don't get those here. Well, actually, in reality, the #1 disaster in this country, year in and year out, on a dollar amount basis, is flooding. It is bigger than fire, theft, and wind combined. So flooding is actually the biggest natural disaster in our country on a yearly basis. Some of the biggest floods in Arizona's history were actually due to dying tropical systems, i.e. hurricanes, that came in and sat over the state for several days, such as the 1983 floods. Flooding also poses a greater threat to homeowners nationwide than do fire and theft combined. Flood insurance is required in any flood zone. Not true. Everyone lives in a flood zone because, according to the federal government, there's no such thing as being out of the floodplain. But not everyone is required to have flood insurance. Under federal law, only those living in a high-risk zone, i.e. the zones that have a or V designation. So an A, AE, AH, AO, A99, or V or VE are required to have flood insurance if they are getting a mortgage through a federally backed program or institution. However, there is what we call the golden rule. That is, he who has the gold gets to make the rules. Generally speaking, in that situation, the banks can require flood insurance regardless of what the situation is. In that case, we do strongly recommend people check with our office first and foremost to make sure that they do or do not require flood insurance under the federal regulations and what steps they can do to make sure they get the right insurance if they don't. My homeowner's insurance covers flooding. This is very rarely, if ever, true. Flood insurance needs to be purchased separately from homeowner's insurance. If there's any doubt, ask the insurance provider. Flood insurance is always expensive. Pretty much, yes. It can be inexpensive depending on the home, but it also depends on the circumstances. If you live outside the high-risk area or have a home that is properly elevated to the regulatory elevation or even higher and have whatever enclosures meeting code, flood insurance can be very affordable. However, there are times and conditions where flood insurance is expensive. There are ways to look at this on a situational basis and try to alleviate those costs. And those are things that the district office can help people with in terms of looking at where they might be able to make changes to the building to better their insurance premiums. But at the end of the day, the actual premiums for a building is going to be based on the mapping and the elevations of the building. So it's a case-by-case basis. Taxpayers are footing the bill for flood insurance. The National Flood Insurance Program actually does not spend any tax dollars and is expected to pay back any tax dollars it receives from the federal government with interest. The federal government is bringing flood insurance policies up to full risk rates, or what we call actuarial rates, nationally in order to have the insurance program work as most programs do. Most programs work by bringing in enough premiums from policyholders on a yearly basis to cover the expected claims and operating expenses based on the average historical loss year. For decades, the National Flood Insurance Program was subsidized by the federal government. People were getting discounted rates. Therefore, it wasn't bringing in as much money as it needed, and it's getting loans from the federal government that it has to pay back in order to keep operating. Private companies offer insurance. The federal government does not need to. At this time, the National Flood Insurance Program offers, generally speaking, more affordable rates, especially to people in the higher risk areas of flooding. The big difference between private insurance and federal insurance is that private insurance companies can drop insurance policy holders or refuse to issue a policy if they think the risk is high. The National Flood Insurance Program cannot do this by law. People who live along the coast and beaches out east use flood insurance more than people inland do. In actuality, the vast majority of the properties that are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program are actually inland properties along river systems. They're not coastal properties. This is because many beach areas are actually off limits to the National Flood Insurance Program because the risk there is just simply too high. The National Flood Insurance Program pays for people in more high-risk areas with our premiums. This is a common misconception of how insurance programs generally work. Generally speaking, an insurance program is a pool. Everybody who is in the pool pays into the program to cover risk, and they pay a different amount depending on their risk. You may not make a claim for years, if ever. So many people have their home for decades and never use their homeowner's insurance. There are some people who drive a car for decades and never have to use their auto insurance, but they still have those insurance policies either because it's a regulatory requirement or they want the peace of mind of having that coverage. Flood insurance is basically the same type of program. So yes, areas that are experiencing less flooding right now are paying for areas that are having more flooding right now. But when the roles reverse, the same is still true. The flood maps show that I am outside the high-risk flood zone, so I won't get flooded. Not necessarily true, unfortunately. I wish it was true. Many of us in floodplain management wish this was true. The maps show the risk in certain areas based on the best available scientific information, but that does not mean they're completely accurate. They only show flooding in watersheds larger than a certain size for most of the country. That's 1 square mile. So smaller watersheds, which are more reactive to smaller rainstorm events, don't get mapped in general. They only show flooding associated with a specific size event. So the mapping is done to what many people refer to as the 100-year event, which is a bad name. It really should be called the 1% annual flood. And that's because the event that is looked at and mapped and regulated to is an event that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. It's not an event that happens once every 100 years. It just has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. But floods larger than that can happen. We do hear about the 500-year, the 1,000-year, 250-year flood event. Not to mention the fact that this is based on statistics and the data set we need for the statistics is incomplete. So the confidence level in these event sizes is not very strong. They only show flooding based on conditions in the watershed at the time of the mapping. Conditions do change over time. The channels migrate, you get erosion, you get deposition, you get new buildings, you get old buildings torn down, you get trees that grow, they die. All these different changes can affect how the water is flowing through the floodplain. 20% of the claims in the National Flood Insurance Program are actually outside the high-risk areas and account for about 1/3 of the overall flood disaster assistance paid out to date in the program. So just because you're outside what is mapped as a high hazard area doesn't mean you are not at risk. It just means that your risk is perceived either to be lower or hasn't really been looked at in reality. The area was not flood prone until they showed it on the maps. This is one that we encounter quite often. The floodplains are actually a natural feature. They are where the flow of water over time has interacted with the land surface to create a physical feature in the landscape. Mapping doesn't create the floodplains, mapping shows the floodplains. Anywhere water can flow, there is a potential for flooding, hence a risk of flooding. Just because the risk is not or was not shown on a map does not mean that it did not exist at that time. It simply means that at the time of the mapping, there was not enough expected development in the area to require or warrant mapping be done. Is there anything realtors can do to help lower insurance premiums? Interestingly enough, yes, there is. Under the community rating system program, if a majority of the realtors in a community would pledge to and then actually follow through with providing flood hazard information in their listings, the community can get additional credit under the community rating system program. The more credit we get, the better our ranking and the lower flood insurance rates become. The district offers this information as a free service and usually turns around the request within 1 to 2 business days, although it can take up to 10 business days, depending on the situation. Obviously, if we're in the middle of a flood event, we're going to be out dealing with the flooding and trying to help people who are being damaged rather than processing flood hazard information sheets. So it's a simple commitment the realtors could take to help, but the realtors must provide potential buyers the information on whether a property is in the special flood hazard up front. Besides, the surest and easiest way you can protect yourself from claims that you did not disclose the flood risk and flood insurance premiums is to put it out there right at the beginning when you list the property. With that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to this four-part series. My name is John Hayes. My contact phone number is 520-375-7830. My email is jhayes@santacruzcountyaz.gov. Please, if you have any questions about this or any other floodplain or flood insurance matter, please feel free to give us a call, and I'll be glad to help you or at least direct you on where you can get the best information and answer possible. Thank you.